whenever somebody has called me and said, look, our district is considering adopting this educational reform, like STEM, for example, is the newest one. And I always say, well, do you have a new administrator? And they say, well, how did you know? I said, because you're implementing reform.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Everything Band, a podcast that features conversations with composers, conductors, and performers of music for winds and percussion. My name is Mark Connor. I'm a composer and educator, and each week I have the great fortune to speak with and share the stories and wisdom of musicians and leaders in the band community. Before we begin, I'd like to thank all of you for listening. I really appreciate your time, and I hope that you are finding value from these interviews. I rely on word of mouth and social media to bring the show to new listeners. If you think you know one or two people who might find these interviews useful, please let them know about it. You can also help by following me and sharing posts on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Everything Band is sponsored by Celtic Horizon Arts, the leading tour operator for the arts in the United Kingdom and Ireland. Celtic Horizon Arts hosts bands, orchestras, and choirs from around the world, and they are now taking inquiries for their 2020 Band Festival in Limerick, Ireland. This festival, featuring composer Johan de May, will include clinics, masterclasses, and cultural exchanges. Bands and individual musicians are all welcome to participate and can find out more by contacting Keith Kelly at keith@celtichorizontours.com or find out more on Facebook at Celtic Horizon Arts. Now, on to the episode and this week's guest, John Benham. Hi, John.
Good morning.
How are you today?
Doing well up here in Minnesota. Winter's finally over. We had 30 plus inches of snow in April, and we're glad to see spring.
Wow, 30 plus inches.
That's just in April.
So, John, can you introduce yourself for my listeners? Tell them what you do.
Sure. I actually do a variety of things. I'm retired for the second time now, but still seem to be working. I teach ethnomusicology, primarily distance education now. I have a nonprofit organization called Music and World Cultures. My son has actually taken over that now, and I only work with that a little bit. I still teach about 5 or 6 classes a year. On the side, I repair music instruments, and a hobby of mine that's gone kind of crazy is saving school music programs that are facing cuts.
Yeah, and that's really why I wanted to have you on. We met at the Texas Music Educators Association conference. I went to your sessions, and I was very impressed. And so I decided I wanted to have you talk to my listeners about these issues because it's very, very important. So, John, can you tell the listeners like how you got your musical start, your musical origin story?
Oh, sure. I was obviously a young person living in southern Michigan, actually in Battle Creek. I've been through both Post and Kellogg several times. My mother actually worked for Kellogg's. My mother was a church organist, pianist. My dad was a singer, choir director. And I sat in the living room whenever I could. And these are the days before television. And I turned on my radio every week listening to the Band of America concerts. And it really just kind of got me interested in that. That plus my family's background historically. My mother also played violin. And music just seemed to be part of the genetic inheritance, I guess.
I see. And so how about what was your instrument early on?
I started played piano for a while or took lessons. I wasn't overly successful at that. And then when I moved to Minnesota from Michigan, I was across the street from a middle school, and they had a band program, and the only instrument they had was available that was free was a baritone. So I started on the baritone. I eventually ended up, at one point in college, I was playing trumpet in a trumpet trio, third part. I was alternating between French horn and trombone in the pep band, and then I was playing tuba in a brass sextet and euphonium in the concert band. So I had a pretty good set of chops in those days.
I also know you mentioned to me that you sang as well.
I actually had a double major on my undergraduate level in vocal and instrumental education. I did my performance in voice, actually, and then my brass was secondary at that point. But in the graduate school, I went all instrumental.
And where'd you go to school?
I did my undergraduate at Northwestern College in Minneapolis, now called the University of Northwestern St. Paul. And I did my graduate work at the University of Northern Colorado in Greeley.
Do you remember anything from your high school or middle school, something that sticks out, maybe the moment where you decided that you wanted to be a music teacher or go into music as a profession?
I think really, probably my first experience at school was an inner city school, actually. And my first director, was a wonderful guy. He was a Golden Gloves boxer and a clarinet player and a fine clarinet player. And he just really showed an interest in us, and I thought gave us a good foundation. Plus the fact that I was living inner city, having moved there from, frankly, a rural area, was quite a shock to me. And so I just sat with my horn in the evenings and in our apartment and practiced 2 or 3 hours a day because it was a lot safer than being out on the street. And then from there, I moved to North Dakota, Minot, North Dakota, actually. A phenomenal music program, wonderful band director, wonderful choral director. And eventually, actually, after college, went back and taught there along with that staff. And I've had excellent teachers all along the way, including moving in between there to a smaller town in Minnesota, in between the Twin Cities here and North Dakota, to a wonderful band director who just kind of took me under his arm and gave me lessons personally and everything. So all the way through, I've had wonderful music teachers.
Yeah, I think that's a common thread among most musicians I speak to, is that at some point we've all had a teacher who really did something for us that made us want to kind of be a musician or to be a teacher.
Yeah, and the other thing that I found with them is so many times you hear about the really fine teachers being tyrants. I didn't have any of those. I think these people were good enough. Maybe they didn't need to be that way.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, I think that's an old-fashioned kind of thing. I've spoken with this with other guests, but sort of that old style, that old school band director. I think that might be a myth that's blown a little bit out of proportion.
Well, I think it's also gone by the wayside. I think our musicians are so fine now. They don't really tolerate that kind of attitude. And frankly, I don't think it's necessary anymore. We've got so much better music education going on in the public schools than we did when I was a kid.
Yeah, I agree with you. And so speaking about teaching, you mentioned to me that you taught band and choir, and then you eventually moved into instrumental music as a specialty. So what type of hard-earned advice do you have for maybe teachers who are starting out, maybe that you would like to pass on?
Well, I guess I'm influenced not only by my own teachers, but my own attitudes. And by my experience doing this advocacy work over 30 plus years, I think that the thing that bothers me most about music teachers is when we talk about my band or my choir or my orchestra. It's not ours. One of the things Frederick Fennell said that I like so much was, when you get on the podium, you don't have a right to be thinking of yourself. You think of the music first and your students and how they work with it, and the musicians. So I think that what we look at, particularly in public school, is the public owns these programs. It's for the public's children. And we don't have a right to think about ourselves. And related to that, I've in my advocacy work, I've now asked over 30,000 teachers, most of them music teachers, what is our mission? And almost without exception, they'll tell me the mission is to teach or educate children. And that's not our mission. The mission is learning. So the teaching and the educating is our role. So if we look at the student perspective, well, being there for the student, the issue is learning, not teaching. And so I think that's perhaps the key thing in education today. One of our key issues is that we're thinking about our own issues rather than those that are students. And I think we need to change that focus, really. We have no right to put anything else at the center other than the child or student.
Yeah, I agree. So, John, just quickly before we dive into your advocacy, I want to ask you about the nonprofit. Do you want to share some information about that? It seems like a really great thing you're doing there.
Are you referring to Music and World Cultures?
Yes.
Well, Music and World Cultures is something I started in 1989, having returned from a trip to Indonesia. And I've always been interested in peoples of the world and world music and issues related to that. And so I started a program in ethnomusicology, essentially equipping musicians as missionaries, actually, and working with mission agencies as a faith-based organization. And then eventually we ended up in Ukraine as our first project after we had our educational program established. And suddenly it just started exploding. So we now work in over 25 countries on 5 different continents. My son actually has taken over that now. Stephen is the past president of the American String Teachers Association. And just in Ukraine, for example, we now have about 10,000 young people studying music in the various schools that have been established there. We have also offices also in Europe, in Estonia, with one of our Ukrainian grads running that, and we run all of our European programs out of there. And then we have one of our graduates in Ukraine and our offices in Ukraine running our programs that are in Asia, South Central Asia. And then this last year, we started working in Africa for the first time, and all I can tell you about that is that we just started working in Africa. We're not sure where that's headed, and we never do know, but it's been a great, great thing to watch that develop and see how many people now are playing and making music that otherwise never had the opportunity. These countries, for the most part, in poverty. I know we recently received a picture from a family in Ukraine, and they were keeping 20 children, all of whom were refugees coming out of the part that Putin is coming over and taking in Ukraine now. And all that they possessed was the clothes they had on their back and the instrument they were carrying with them.
That's pretty remarkable. So, John, if you don't mind me asking, what you said you had always had an interest in the people of other cultures and other cultures, but musicology, that switch, what was that like?
Well, yeah, and of course, I'm in ethnomusicology.
I'm sorry, yes, I misspoke.
Slightly different than musicology, although they're starting to do more things together now, I think. Well, I had been teaching up until 81 and, pursuing the university band director show. And for a variety of reasons, I decided I was going to stop that. Part of that was Proposition 13 impacting my position when I was teaching in California. And I really had always been interested in this world music thing anyway. And suddenly I found myself developing this program, a master's degree, and it's just become my passion. And I suppose having taught 2 years inner city had an impact on that as well. Just finding these students who were deeply interested in making music, but never had the opportunity.
Yeah, sure. All right. So we should probably talk about the main reason why I wanted to speak with you, and that's your music advocacy and your book. And so your book is titled, I'm just going to pull it up, make sure I get it absolutely correct, Music Advocacy, Moving from Survival to Vision. And so what I'd like to do is maybe have you explain a bit about your work in advocacy and how you got started with that.
Sure. Well, when we left Cal State Fullerton in 1981, we moved our family to Minnesota, and I decided that I was not going to teach for a while, and I went full-time with my music instrument repair business, which I still enjoy in my semi-retirement. And so we selected a program in Minnesota that we thought was really fine, just marvelous bands, choirs, orchestra, the full component of curricular content. And we moved in on August 28th, and on September 7th, they had a mill levy go down and decided that they were going to eliminate the entire 4th, 5th, and 6th grade instrumental program. As a parent who had just told his kids and promised them, we're going to move from California to Minnesota, but you're going to have this wonderful music program, I was not in a good position with my own family. And so I was upset, and I decided as a parent I was going to become involved in this action of trying to save this program and reverse this decision. Now, to try to give more clarity to it, this was a district of about 11,000 students and 700 teachers. And this $8 million deficit meant eliminating 150 out of 700 teachers. Well, they first, of course, went right after the elementary music program because it's a pull-out program, and they made the assumption that you could still start the kids in 7th grade without any negative impact. And because there was a classroom teacher there, they just would still, they thought they saw this as a total financial savings. Well, I decided I was going to rewrite Bennett's book and Reimer's book and anything else that had ever been written on why it was important to have a music program. And be better than anybody ever else had written. And I wrote the first paragraph, and I said, this is ridiculous. All 7 board members have kids in music, as did the superintendent of schools. They didn't want to cut the music program, but the financial crisis exposed their educational philosophy, which was cut music first.
Right.
And so I realized if I was going to help the parents and work myself as a parent to try and save this program, I had to come up with something else. In other words, since this was a budget crisis, I needed to defeat the budget issue. I didn't know what that meant because nobody teaches that in college. And so I started studying, and my report was due on Monday afternoon, and it was Sunday night at midnight, and I was so tired. I said, I know the answers here. I can't figure it out. And I woke up at 3:00 in the morning. It was like it was written on the wall. It's in the numbers, you dummy. Go check the numbers. And I had all the data from the music teachers. And I sat down and I started looking. I said, oh my goodness, the classroom teachers have 125 students each, and the music teachers had 210. Now, this is secondary level. In other words, if they lose this music program, they're going to end up hiring more teachers to replace the band teachers, because your classroom teacher is only going to take 125. They're not going to take 210. So there are 85 kids or 3 classes worth of people that they've got to find a teacher for. So that's where we came up with this concept of reverse economics, where, as the superintendent who was there at the time now says, and you can find his quote in the Instrumentalist magazine, and I'd have to look up the date for you on that, August of I don't know, 10 years ago or something. He said, after you understand this concept of reverse economics, that you never save any money by cutting your music program. So I started looking at this. I said, okay, if they cut this 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, what happens? Well, what we've discovered was immediately they would have eliminated 1,800 kids from participation. Where were you going to put those kids? Well, the first year, by the number of kids they would have eliminated and those moving into the middle school, they would have had to hire 6.4 teachers to replace the 5.2 they were going to cut. By the 5th year, they would have had to hire so many teachers to replace the band teachers and orchestra teachers they would lost because of student loss, that it would have ended up with a negative budget decision of $500,000 a year. So I gave this presentation to the school board with probably 700 parents present who had a tag that said no music cuts. And about 45 minutes of presentation, after which the board said, if we're going to solve this budgetary problem, we're going to make it on a budgetary basis, not a philosophical one. And they voted 7-0 to reinstate the program, and instead eliminated 150 teachers in other areas of the curriculum. We actually went back 14 years in the tenure track, cutting math, science, and English teachers to solve the financial problem. Now, that was 1981. I just talked to one of the teachers from this district. I had met him at a concert about a month ago, and asked him how things were going. He said, you know what? They have never come back and cut us again. In fact, we've added positions over this year since 1981. So naturally, that word went around rather quickly, and I found myself working in 2 or 3 or 4 other districts in Minnesota. In the meantime, neglecting my new business, which had been set up here. And then all of a sudden, I was in the neighboring state, and then somebody else called me, and suddenly I found myself so busy with this that I couldn't keep my business. Then the music industry got a hold of it in 1990, 1991, and they said, we want you to do this full time. Well, that was the same time as starting Music and World Cultures, but I said, it's full time is not really wise because it's such a seasonal thing. But they set up a fund so I could do that. And for 10 years, had that fund basically as an open account. Any district that called me, I could say, yes, I will come. And I didn't have to worry about my expenses or raising funds for it. And so since then, I've worked in with over 400 school districts, 47 states, and 6 Canadian provinces, and saved in the neighborhood of, now I should add, I don't save any programs. I equip the parents with the information and strategies. They save it. But it's now exceeded $75 million in programs, which is around 1,500 teaching positions for 500,000 kids a year.
I want to ask you, there's a lot in here. Can you delve a little bit more deeply into the idea of reverse economics?
Sure. In education, we have what we call FTE, which is a full-time equivalent position. And so if we take that full-time equivalent position, that would be a 1.0. 1.0 would then equal full-time. So if a person taught 5 classes, one class would be 0.2 FTE, or 2/10 or 1/5 of a load. So based upon that, we established in the district what they call a ratio point. So that 1.0 teaching position, let's just for the ease of calculations in our head say the 1.0 FTE teaching position is $50,000. And then if 1.0, and that was, let's say that's a 9-month position, we might find that a 1.0 administrative position at 12 months is $75,000. That's still 1.0. Well, a 1.0 clerical position might be a 9-month position. We might say that's $25,000. Well, based upon those ratio calculations financially, then they establish a ratio. So the central administration might say to the high school principal, the ratio this year is 25-1. So for every 25 students in that school, that principal gets 1.0 FTE money or $50,000. So then if there's a $300,000 deficit, then they know they have to cut 6 teaching positions. Now, this is all based upon the concept of average. Of course, average, is what one of my economist friends calls a fictitious number used by economists for the convenience of manipulating figures. Because we know that in education, you never cut the position that's 50,000. You're always cutting positions below that. So if you take the $300,000 figure and $50,000, you're going to cut 6 positions, but those 6 positions are all low seniority. So you don't save the $300,000 in reality, but you do save it on paper. So what happens is they come back in a couple of years and they have to do more cuts because they never saved the $300,000 they originally did. Now, how does this work then from the economic perspective? Well, if we have an average FTE value, we would say, therefore, that FTE value for the classroom teacher is an average load of 150 students, or 30 per class. Well, if that classroom teacher has 150 students and 30 per class, and your music teacher has an average of 200, we're talking music performance here, the music teacher has an excess of 50 students. That's equivalent then to roughly 2 classes or 0.4 FTE. So if you cut that music position or lose it because you've cut its feeder program, and I'll get back to that in a second, then you have to hire 1.4 teachers to replace that music person, unless you put them in study hall, which I've had people try to do, or you just increase class size. Well, my point is, if you're going to increase class size by cutting that position, why cut a position that has 50 students in the class and only 1 teacher in the subject area, when you could cut a teacher in the subject area that maybe has 10 teachers teaching that and only have to increase that by 30 students? So the other thing then about this reverse economic thing then is that music teacher then having a load of 1.4 FTE equivalent still is getting paid 1.0. Well, that 1.4 FTE is what we call the FTE value. So there's an FTE that they use, which is an average calculation, but there's an actual calculation, which is the FTE value of the individual teacher. And your music teachers always have the highest FTE value because they have the highest number of students in a class and the highest student loads. Now, the other significant thing here is we have found in those districts that have cut, well, let me restate this. Districts who have cut programs and no longer begin students in grade 5, or districts that start students after grade 5, have 65% less enrollment or 65 greater attrition than districts that start in grade 5. So grade 5, statistically, we have discovered after 37 years of research, is the optimum time for students to participate or begin participation in instrumental music. So in other words, you don't really save any money by cutting a music teacher. And the thing that we're careful about here is we group all music teachers together, because I got one district right now, they're saying, well, the orchestra numbers are lower, so shouldn't we just cut that? And I said, well, look at your math curriculum. Your physics classes, your calculus classes are all lower. Why don't you cut those? So what we do is we look at the whole program as a total, and we take the average of all teachers. Now, one other point about this 1.4 FTE value, if you have 1.4 band teacher, choir teacher, and orchestra teacher, in that school, they have an excess value of 1.2 FTE, and now you've just paid for your elementary instrumental music position.
John, this is all makes a ton of sense, and I have a bunch of questions for you that jump out, but I'm going to take one out of context here, because you just mentioned something that really stuck with me from your presentation in San Antonio, and that's the idea of music teachers sticking together and not throwing each other under the bus so that the political capital from all of the parents of the music program is greater.
Well, and also your political power is. Now, let me give you an example of that. I worked in a school district, and there was a school district that was doing pay for play. That is, they were going to charge fees. And what happened is they grouped the band, choir, and orchestra into all the athletic events. And I always stay out of an athletics versus music battle for two reasons. Number one, you may lose. Number two, once you start comparing yourself to athletics, you've now moved yourself into the extracurricular realm. And I like to keep as curricular. So what I was able to do was demonstrate that there was no justification charging music students fees for pay to play. But before I did it, I said, I'd like to know how many of you parents here have kids in band, and several raised. How many of you parents have kids in orchestra? Several stood up. How many of you had kids in choir? Several stood up. Well, they were always the same parents because they had kids in all of them. Said, now how many of you have kids in athletics? Almost every parent stood. So the point I'm making, this wasn't an athletics versus a music battle. And so the other point that I'm showing with that is the music parents are already unified. They see that as a music program. The teachers, then I said, how many of your band teachers, choir teachers, orchestra teachers, they stand up, they're looking at their own area. Now, theoretically, philosophically, we all believe in music education. But when it comes to saving our program, our job, we suddenly become self-centered. And the greatest issue I have fought in my 37 years is the lack of unity in our profession. What I mean by this, the only time we have ever lost saving a program in 37 years, one of two things was present or not present. One was the lack of a music coalition, which was unified and supportive of the whole program, and therefore didn't show up to save the program. And the second one was one or more teachers undermined the process and suggested a cut in the other people's area. And so unity becomes a key factor. In fact, I did a keynote address in one state. I won't name the state. And I was supposed to have 45 minutes to present. Well, by the time they got through introducing this person and that person and this giving this award and accepting the award, I had 2 minutes left. So I went up with my presentation. I put that big slide on that just said unity. And I spoke for a minute on unity as music educators and went and sat down.
Yeah, isn't that it's sad to me that we think that way, but I guess when we perceive a threat, we get selfish or we lose sight of the big picture.
Well, it goes again from the idea of having a student-centered concept to one which is teacher-centered.
Yeah, you mentioned adult decisions and kid-centered decisions in that presentation.
Well, actually, if I look at educational reform, all block schedule, a school to work, tax vouchers, charter schools, magnet schools, what have I missed? Middle schools versus junior high schools. You'll almost always find, in fact, you will always find there's an adult issue in there somewhere. Whenever somebody has called me and said, look, our district is considering adopting this educational reform, like STEM, for example, is the newest one. And I always say, well, do you have a new administrator? And they say, well, how did you know? I said, because you're implementing reform. Reform always involves a new person who's coming in and either thinks what you have isn't successful or more likely developing their leadership image and resume as an agent of change. And of course, as you'll always hear me say, change just means change. It doesn't necessarily guarantee improvement.
Yes. So, John, as we talk about these reform issues, one thing that's been really common in the last couple of decades is the idea of block scheduling. And I know that you're not an advocate of block scheduling for music programs. Why not specifically?
Well, because there are examples in the book, by the way, of several different schedules, as I'm sure you're aware. But block schedule, to me, is one of the primary things that's come around as a great innovator to help students in education. And indeed, there is only one example or one scientifically demonstrated result over the last 60 years or so that we've seen this kind of stuff. And that is students get better grades. Well, they're covering less material. in school, and therefore that is a result. Now, there's a lot of issues related to block schedule, and I always go through, whenever I do this, what are the adult issues? In other words, for the administration, what are the adult issues for the teachers? Well, you'll find the administrator's job has changed quite a bit because they have less courses to schedule. They have less discipline problems because students aren't in the hallway as many times. And the teacher issue is they have increase in prep time and a decrease in teaching time, usually the equivalent to about 50 minutes, if you compare the one example I have in the book. Well, that's fine. If the teacher's job, the administrator's job is easier, I want to know what happens to students. But if you compare, for example, a block schedule, whether it's A, B, or 4x4, where they go to 4 periods a day, compared with an old 6-period day where you had 355-minute school day, what you'll find is that the students' loss of instructional time per course, not just in music, but per course, is about 8 weeks of instructional time. So on a 55-minute period day that meets 180 times, you have 9,900 minutes of instruction. On an 85-minute period with a block schedule, theoretically increasing your time on task, you end up with only 90 class meetings or 7,650 minutes, which is a loss of 2,250 minutes, I think, or 8 weeks of instructional time. So the student, while they may get better grades in Algebra 1, they have less class meetings, less class time. So they don't achieve the same number of competencies. So they take Algebra 2. Algebra 1, they've lost 8 weeks of instructional time. Algebra 2, they've lost 8 weeks of instructional time, which is the equivalent almost of a full semester. So what we find is in order for the students to get through the same competencies they had on the old schedule, they have to add Algebra 3 as a requirement. Now the teacher gets paid 3 times what they used to get paid twice for, and the student loses any concept of being able to get another elective, which is one of the reasons they theoretically adopt block schedule. It's more expensive. Class sizes have to increase and staffing has to increase. Depending on how you implement it, you may also have to get new facilities.
So, John, what are the primary components of a strong music advocacy program?
Well, there are really 4, in my opinion, 4 basic components of a good music advocacy program. And the first of those is the coalition. You have to have a coalition. This is your political power. Most decisions are made by your school board based upon what is given to them, for information given to them from the administration. And school boards are often called rubber stamps. By the way, I don't know if we've just mentioned this, but I did serve 6 years on the school board, which is where I learned a lot of this stuff. But you have to have that coalition, and the way it should be organized, I've outlined in the book, but there's also a really wonderful book GIA has published on putting together the Music Boosters Group, and I don't have the name of that in front of me. That coalition needs to be organized in such a way that it represents all areas of the curriculum and all schools in the curriculum, all levels. As you have your elementary people involved, by the time they have kids in high school, they're ready to take over the leadership. But this is where your political power is. If a teacher comes in, and so many times teachers, they think they can go in and speak their piece and they have all this power and can get whatever they want. They go in and talk to the school board administration and simply, sorry, but this is the situation. And they realize suddenly they don't have any power unless it's given to them. Whereas your parent group walks in, and it doesn't have to be restricted to parents, by the way, it can be the whole community. And they say, this is what we want. They have to listen. Or as I've said on many occasions, I've yet to see an administrator or a school board member who fired a parent. It just doesn't work that way. And suddenly when the music coalition walks in, they know they have to listen and they have to deal with the issues. So the music coalition is number one. Secondly, you have to have a unified profession. We've already talked about that. The teachers themselves need to hang together, and they get out of the advocacy process. They give that to the parents, and they go back and teach. Then the third thing that's really important is, do you understand how the district functions financially, how their decision-making functions, who makes which decisions? A key one is, do you understand the difference between those decisions that a central administration makes compared to those that a site administrator like your principal would make? Because some cuts are made by your central administration. Those are usually any part of your music curriculum that is itinerant, that is, a teacher has multiple schools. That budget decision falls under your central administration. whereas all the other things fall into the site base. So if the administration sends out their new budget for next year and the principal realizes that he or she has to cut 5 teachers, they have complete autonomy to do that, and they can cut whatever they want. So you need to be aware of those decisions which are made where. And the key there is whenever you see the phrase going to increase class sizes, that means we're cutting teachers, and you better find out where they're cutting them.
Right.
And that's what you learn from the site administrator. So the fourth thing then is, do you understand the process? I would say probably in 90 to 95% of the cases with which I've dealt, people have called me within 7 to 10 days before the decision was actually scheduled to be made by the school board. Now, I can tell you this has been under discussion for at least 6 months, if not a year to 2 years, because the way property taxation works in many states is a 2-year decision. So you're constantly working ahead. So your school board begins discussing this no later than July of the current year that they're making the decision in. And then the decision comes in March or April. And that's oftentimes the first time the parents find out about it because they're not attending the school board meetings. So that's the other thing, is understanding how that process is made. And it goes all the way from the legislature all the way down to the local school board, understanding those decision-making process.
So there's a lot in there. John, I wanted not to put too fine a point on this, but teachers need to stay out of this because their job's at stake, correct?
Well, there are two reasons they need to. It undermines the credibility of the program, because I don't care how legitimate a case you have and how calm you are speaking, there are several issues. One, you're going to be too emotional and you can't think on your feet as well. Secondly, you're perceived of as saving your job, even though you're there to save the kids. And I know that that's why we do that. But when they look at you, they say, he's just here saving his job. The third thing is you're subordinate.
Yeah, and vulnerable.
They can say you're being insubordinate. Now, anybody who's intimidated and said they can't talk about this, that's against the law. You cannot intimidate a teacher that way. It's public information. By law, they have the right to share that. So any teacher that gets threatened that way, you're going to lose your job. You document that. Time, place, name, people, any witnesses, and you record that and send it to your union lawyer, because it's illegal for them to intimidate you in that way. Now, so understanding that school system and that process is very important. Now, I can tell you, I have yet to find a school board that didn't wait until the last meeting in the fiscal year to actually make that decision. And that's usually like the last meeting in June.
Yep.
So even though the program has been voted to be cut, that can still be changed if you get the right information, which is what I usually provide. And then you get your parents organized, you can almost always save it. I think our overall record in saving programs, and again, remind you, it's the parents that actually save it, is in the neighborhood of 90 to 95%.
Wow. So, John, one of the things I'm struck by is if I'm a teacher in the classroom and my district seems healthy and the music programs seem healthy, there might be signs that there's trouble on the horizon. What am I looking for as a teacher?
Well, the first thing I look for is has anybody mentioned educational reform? And the second one is, has anybody at all talked about a budget crisis? Mm-hmm. I think there's I should have the book in front of me. There's a list in the book of key phrases to look for.
Yep, there is.
But those are the two key. If there's any hint at all of budget talk, you're on the list. Mm-hmm. And if there's any hint at all of new administration coming in, keep your eyes open for reform. We're bringing in this new administrator because he's demonstrated his ability to make change and to improve. Well, again, change doesn't necessarily guarantee improvement.
All right, John, just a couple questions left about advocacy. And that's, what if a district contacts you about how to get their program restored or to start a new one or to expand?
Well, they can go to my website, which is basically save-music.org.
I'll definitely link that in the show notes so anyone who's listening can find that.
That'd be great, yeah.
Yeah, and finally, what's the process you use in working with the district to help them save their program? What does it look like?
Yeah, it's a good question. They give me a call, and if it's a teacher that calls me, I say have a parent call me because I want to work with parents. I want the teachers out of it, not because of I don't want them involved, but because of the fact that I want them to not be the face of it because of this conflict of interest idea. So parents will call me, sometimes a music store. In fact, I would say probably a music store more often calls me than the teacher does. So the first thing I want to do is I want to be contacted by the parent or parents group. And there are several reasons for that. One, again, is that brings me in a position of power, not personal power, but parental power. Secondly, I want to work with parents because we have to discuss the issue of funding. And there are three ways we fund it. I always tell them contact every local music store for a voluntary contribution. And secondly, they will contact their suppliers for contributions. Second thing we want to do is we want to have the music boosters kick in some money. And then the third thing we do is we pass the hat. We pass the hat at a public meeting, which I'll get to in a second. And then that almost always brings it, whatever is required. And the costs vary depending on the expenses and how much time it involves. And I've worked in school districts as small as 600 all the way up to 1.2 million. You might imagine writing a statistical study and drawing up all this report, which, by the way, usually includes a whole analysis of what the faculty issues are, the curricular issues are, the issues related to student participation, and issues related to the economic viability of the program. So a report that I write for a smaller district, I just finished a small district of about 7,000 students, and their report was 50 pages. I did Fairfax County, Virginia. That report, as I recall, was 155 pages. So you don't do this kind of work for free. And so they call me and I say, okay, here's what I want. I have a survey form, which is on the website called the Public School Participation Survey. And there are 3 pages to that form. Pages 1 and 2 are completed by one parent who takes it to the central district office and gets the information, very basic information, which by law is public. Then page 3 is given to each music teacher, a copy to each music teacher. They fill in their load. Based upon that, I do a statistical analysis of their FTE, their FTE value, their student participation rates at each grade level. What are their enrollment disparities, or which relates to attrition? And what is the value of that program? And then I write the report. That report I have ready in a rough draft form before I come to the district. I come to the district usually on a Thursday night, sometimes on a Tuesday, depending on the size of the district. The first meeting I have is with all the music teachers. Anybody who teaches even one course in music is going to be at that meeting. I want to go over all the data with them. I want to talk about the process with them. I want to talk about the importance of them activating their parents, but staying out of it for the reasons we've already discussed. And then I want to confirm the data. And then I go through actually a process of probably could be called conflict resolution. But I want to deal with this issue of unity and make sure that we're all together before we leave that room. Let's assume that takes place on a Thursday night. Well, between Thursday night, again, having already come with a rough draft of the report done, between Thursday and Saturday, I finish that report in its final form. I present it at a Saturday morning meeting, which usually takes 2 hours to open to the public. Anybody can come who wants. Here's the process that we're going through here. Here are the issues. Here are your political rights and responsibilities by law as a parent. And then I go through the data of their district and demonstrate it, show exactly what's going to happen if the district makes this decision to the student participation, the curriculum, the student faculty ratios, the budgetary issues, and so on. And then following that meeting, at the end of that meeting, we select a parent leadership team, meet with them anywhere from 2 to 5 hours, going through the report word by word in detail, making sure that it's everything from correcting commas and typographical errors to do you understand the program and hear what the situation is? And then we set up the strategies for how to present it. Then I leave. And of course, I'm always available afterwards for follow-up, which usually is done by telephone.
All right, John, this is something, and I'm going to encourage all the listeners to get your book and read it and to be aware of what could possibly happen to them and how to battle it and how to save their programs.
Yeah, that'll be great. I'm glad to do it. And there's another thing you might just keep in mind. I also have the ability through internet now to Skype in, I actually use Zoom, to music education classrooms and present to music education students about these issues. Or sometimes they'll have a weekend get together. Or I actually do courses at the graduate level where I come into administrative courses in music education and present a whole day and go through the whole process with them too. So those things are always available. And some of the other things I do are available on my website.
I'd like to take a short break from our episode to invite you to listen to my music at markjconnor.com. I am always seeking opportunities for collaboration. If you are interested in commissioning a new piece of music for me, having me work with your students in person or via Skype, or to just say hello, please drop me a line at markjconnor@gmail.com or through the contact form on my website. Where do you draw the line between healthy and unhealthy competition in music?
I really don't like competition at all from that perspective, where you go in and one person gets a one, gets two, or here's the best group, the second group, the third group. And the reason I don't is I don't think it's student-centered. I think it's more adult-centered. Sure, we have the best group. That's great for our kids, but it too many times it becomes a trophy for the teacher. And it doesn't necessarily demonstrate the educational value of the program. I've worked with many districts where their whole program consists of a marching show in the fall and 2 numbers that they practice in the spring to go to contest. And the kids don't know how to read music. They just have been taught this stuff by rote. And to me, one of the key factors of music education curriculum and guidelines is, do you have a music patron or music maker for life? And why is it we don't have more adult bands, orchestras, choirs? Why are they not participating after high school? So I think we've missed that component in setting up our goals and outcomes for music education. The other thing is if you don't get the one, you failed. It isn't necessarily how you've learned or what you've learned. It's just you failed. It's the same way with or any class. A student writes a paper for me in a class. I had one student turn in a 9-page paper, double spaced, and I submitted him a 9-page single spaced evaluation in return. And he was all upset about it. I said, well, what'd you get? He said, I got an A. I said, do you think I'd have wasted that time if I didn't think the paper was worth it? So I think the key issue here is not what did you get as a grade? What did you learn about improving your program or how the program has improved? And more specifically, if you have with that, then there are some now that every contest includes a clinician with it. Now, if the group, the adjudicators say, here's what we heard, here's what we didn't hear, and somebody gets something up from the adjudication and says, now let's work on this and this together, now the students understand. But if they came and didn't understand that and they performed that and go back home, what do they learn?
Right.
So to me, the issue is the clinic and what they learn, not necessarily whether they got a 1, 2, 3, or 4.
So, John, this podcast, listen to a lot of band directors listen to this. Some of them are young. How did you find work-life balance as a musician?
Actually, when I was not doing so many varied things, I didn't have the nonprofit. I didn't do advocacy work. I wasn't teaching full-time. I had kids at home. And so when I had kids at home, my family was first. In fact, I talked to one famous director. I said, do I have any potential as a band director? And he said, yes, but you've got to stop spending so much time with your family. You need to have a score in your hand at all times. And I said, that made my decision, because you only get a chance to raise your family once. So all of this advocacy work in the nonprofit all started when my kids had graduated. So otherwise, I would not have done it.
Well, that's a good answer.
So, yeah, I've had balance in my life. Now, it's not as good as it should be and probably never is. But I do still always put my family first.
There are very few people I talk to on this podcast, and I've talked to many successful music educators who say that they have great work-life balance. I think it's a difficult high-wire act for sure.
Well, I think it was Sir George Holst who said conducting is a what did he say? It was a I forget, some kind of a punishing profession. If you don't punish yourself, it will punish you.
All right, John, we've talked a lot about this in terms of financial things. And so I want to ask you in a sort of a broad sense, what are the challenges facing music education and band, and how can we best meet them?
Well, we're always going to have the budget issue. We're always going to have the political issue. And I want to mention that from a different perspective. One of the things that has really bothered me as a professional educator, and because of my position, I do have a chance to talk to a lot of politicians. Why is it that we seem to think that education is the one thing that we can really attack so easily? Well, we don't have to put specificity to it, so we don't. And consequently, having done that, we just go after education. Now, everybody's had probably a bad teacher. Therefore, we make the assumption teachers aren't good, or education is good. Or we go to test scores and say, well, our test scores are low. Compared to what? I mean, it's always comparing apples and oranges. Like SAT, for example, isn't something a test everybody takes. Now, we've worked in districts. I did a state project in Georgia, a 3-year project, and we discovered the more a district implemented music and arts and a variety of curriculum in music and the arts, the greater their success was on all standardized tests, including those that were required of every student. But we take a test and we compare ourselves with country A or B or C and say, well, we're 26 or 27. Well, but who are they testing and who are we testing? And we don't look at that. And even from that, what is the difference in testing scores from country number 1 to country number 20? The variation really isn't usually that great. But it's an easy way to attack education, and therefore it's an easy way to say we're going to cut taxes or we're going to cut education. And I maybe as music educators, we haven't done as good a job as we should have in demonstrating our curricularness. And so I know I talk about that in the book, the difference between us as a curricular, co-curricular, and extracurricular entity. Most of us haven't bothered to define ourselves that way. And most of us also don't have a written curriculum, or if we do, we aren't looking at it or following it. And, as I worked with over 400 districts, and I have yet to find one that had a written curriculum they were following. Well, if you don't have that curriculum, you can't demonstrate your administration in a specific way, and it has to be in writing. Here's what our students know and are able to do after this course. And so I think it's important to be able to demonstrate that. Now, the other thing is to not be complacent. I think we have to be really aware of that. And ears to the ground, parents involved. Again, those 4 keys to success that I mentioned: understanding the school system, the music coalition, the profession, unity of the profession, understanding the process of decision making. There's always going to be something there because everybody wants their cut of the money. And so I'm working with a couple of states now on some reform issues. And they said, well, our problem isn't money, it's reform. I said, wait a minute. Why are they making this decision? Well, because there's a shortfall in budget to the legislature. There's always a financial issue with every issue of reform. So we just need to be aware and alert. And we get so involved sometimes in the score that we forget that there's other parts of the world that can impact us negatively as well as positively. So we have to be connected. And the annual report, I think, is a really important thing. And I have several districts now that do the annual report and have come back to me several times and said, they came after us again. But we just pulled out the annual report and they said, okay, and backed off again.
Imagine yourself being 18 at your graduation this time of year, looking across the dais at yourself. What advice would you give yourself at that moment?
I don't have any regrets looking backward at all in my life.
Mm-hmm.
As far as what I did, I think I'm doing what I should be doing. I've always felt that way. I guess if there were some things that I would do differently, I probably would work harder at piano as a younger person. I think that would have helped me a great deal. I came from a home where there wasn't, frankly, a great deal of money. Any instrument I got either had to be free from the school or I earned it myself. I never had a music lesson except for 4 years of piano in grade school until I went to college. And so much of this I picked up from some really fine public school teachers and some good teachers when I went to college. But I think that would have helped if I'd had a better music education as a high school, middle school, elementary student from the perspective of piano.
Mm-hmm. I have yet to ask someone this question that hasn't said practice more.
Well, I tell you this. When I was in 6th grade, I told you I lived inner city. And my dad was caretaker in a tenement apartment building. And every apartment had these lockers down in the basement. And because he was the caretaker, I had my own storage unit. And that was my practice room.
Oh, wow.
And because I was living inner city and I was living in the key part of the Twin Cities where all the gang wars were taking place. And so I spent my time in that practice room as a sixth grader and a seventh grader. I was literally practicing my instrument 2 and 3 hours a day. Nobody ever told me to practice. I just did it.
Wow.
I was the only friend I had.
Right. So, John, you were a band director. It's been a while now. But if you had the choice and you could conduct one last work, what would it be?
And you asked me that question. I struggled so long to think of that. There are so many. But I suppose because of the memories I have associated with it, I would probably go back and do the Holst first suite for band again.
That's a very common choice on the podcast. I get lots of that. I get lots of the Granger, Lincolnshire Posy, Irish Tune for County Derry, those pieces.
Well, I love the Fisher-Tull sketches on a Tudor psalm.
Oh, yeah.
And some of the Malcolm Arnold stuff. I mean, there's so many great things. But again, because of the history of my association with it, that whole first suite was one of the first things that I ever did that was a legitimate band work as a student.
Yeah, me too. Great piece. All right, John, we've talked a lot about your book. I'm going to mention it one more time for the listeners. It's called Music Advocacy, Moving from Survival to Vision, and I will link it. Do you have anything coming up that you'd like to share or promote?
I'll be in Midwest again in December. Okay. Chicago, I imagine. I've been there every year for, 15, 20 years. The National Association of Music Merchants always brings me in. So if people want to discuss with me or talk about their issues, I'm usually at the NAMM booth, also sometimes called supportmusic.com. I might be over the GIA booth some, but there'll always be a sign at one of the two places as to where I am. This summer in July, I'm doing the keynote at the Phi Mu Alpha in New Orleans, July.
So, John, how can people get in touch with you?
The easiest way is my website. All my other contact information is on the website, and that's www.save-music.org.
Excellent. So, John, thank you so much for this conversation. This was wonderful.
My pleasure. I assure you, feel free to call me or anybody contact me at any time. Again, the information is on the website.
Excellent. Thanks, John.